Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Confessions of drug taking are not what you would normally expect to dominate a Conservative leadership campaign, but it seems to be the issue won't go away for those vying for the top job. So, does it matter? Joining me from Bristol is the former government drug advisor, Professor David Nutt. Professor Nutt, thank you very much indeed for being with us. You've had your disagreements with the government on the question of drug policy. Do you think someone saying that they have taken drugs, particularly a Class A drug like cocaine in the past, should be a disqualification from high office?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, I think the whole issue about drugs and drug policy has become completely distorted because we don't make sensible decisions about different drugs. I mean, it would be really quite arbitrary to say that someone should be banned from doing anything because they once used a drug. It was illegal when drugs which are equally harmful, such as alcohol, are legal. So drugs policy has always been political. It's never been really based on judgments about individuals' capacity to make decisions or their ability to lead other kind of aspects of their lives.
Yeah, but the point is these people, by and large, and certainly Michael Gove, are saying, yes, I took drugs in the past, yes, I broke the law, but I support the law as it stands, and that seems to be a contradiction, if not pretty hypocritical.
Well, I totally agree with you. It's the ultimate hypocrisy, isn't it? And it really is difficult to understand quite how you could trust them to be honest on anything, because if they're so blatantly dishonest. And I think this gets to the heart of the discussion about drugs. They're not talking about drugs in any sense, in meaningful sense, in relation to the harms. They're talking about drugs, again, as I said, as political tools. The drug laws are being used at present in Britain to control the behaviour of people who are usually disadvantaged and poor and unemployed, and that's wrong. And it's about time a senior politician, and I think we've seen it to some extent from the Lib Dems, but we haven't seen it from Labour or the Tories. Someone's got to stand up and say, look, the drug laws have been a disaster. They've been a failure for the last 50 years. Let's have a royal commission. Let's have a proper investigation into them so that we can get rid of all this rubbish. We can actually stop people pretending that they're doing some good, stop people criticising people for using drugs, and actually work out a way of minimising the harms of drugs so it doesn't disrupt people's careers, whether they're politicians or whether they're delivery drivers or whatever.
Do you think it would be good for society if there was wider use of illegal drugs, or if they were, as a result of them being legalised?
We've done some analysis. My charity, Drug Science, did a very interesting piece of analysis recently for the Norwegian government, looking at what would happen if you put different policy options into place in relation to cannabis. And it turned out that state control of cannabis, the cannabis market, would be clearly give the best outcome in terms of overall health, social, political, economic benefits. We should be doing that kind of analysis for all the drugs that we currently consider to be illegal and working out the optimal way of controlling each one.
Did that work that you did for the Norwegians, did it show that there would be a wider uptake or a lesser uptake of the use of drugs, or use of cannabis if it was legalised?
If cannabis was legalised in a regulated market, a state-controlled market, as they have in Uruguay, there would be no greater use of cannabis, but people would move from the more harmful forms of cannabis, such as skunk and spice, which are much more dangerous and much more addictive, to less harmful forms. So there will be a net health benefit, as well as a lot of other benefits, such as economic benefits from taxation, development of selling outlets, etc.
We do have, of course, experiments in California and other American states with legalisation. What's been the consequences there?
Well, surprisingly little, in the sense that the world hasn't imploded. People are getting access to cannabis in a legal fashion. They can choose the kinds of cannabis they get. They're not going to dealers who are always trying to sell them harder drugs. If you try to buy cannabis on the streets of Britain, you'll almost always be offered something else, usually crack or heroin as well. Separating the cannabis market from the really hard drug market would be a very sensible way forward. It would reduce the harms of all three kinds of drugs.
OK, now what about cocaine? Do you think cocaine should be legalised or available on a controlled market as well?
I think it's on the border, and that's why I've said we haven't had the resources yet to do that analysis, but in the light of these recent discussions and concerns about Michael Gove, I think it's important someone does that, and I'm going to see if I can persuade my charity to find the funding to do an analysis of the best way of regulating cocaine. I would not be surprised if a state-controlled regulated market came out to be the best, but we need to do that research first before I could be confident.
Because I mean, you are ultimately a scientist, and yes. I mean, it's fair to say that taking cocaine or indeed smoking cannabis, both of those are harmful, aren't they?
Oh, all drugs can be harmful. I mean, the question is, what are we trying to achieve with a drug policy? We should be trying to achieve a reduction in harm. The current policy doesn't do that. In fact, if anything, the current policies on cannabis and cocaine lead to increased harms. But worse than that, they also lead to increased harms from legal drugs, particularly alcohol. So what I'm arguing as a scientist is that we should have a rational, scientific-based debate about drugs, drug harms and drug policy, and we should develop policies which do the most good and produce the least harm. We now have a system for doing that. It's complicated. It's called multi-criteria decision analysis. It's very sophisticated. It takes a long time, but it's the sort of thing that government should be doing. That's what I tried to bring in to the ACMD when I was chair of that particular council. I tried to bring in evidence-based decision-making about drugs, harms, and drug policies. That was why I was sacked, because currently drug policy is a political tool. It's not a health tool or a tool for improving, social equality.
But the argument goes that actually, whether legal or illegal, you're not going to have very nice people. You're going to have criminals involved in the supply chain.
Well, not necessarily. As I said to you, when our analysis of the optimal way of dealing with cannabis came down in favour of state regulation of a cannabis market, and that would mean the state growing it as well, and that would get rid of the black market. It's perfectly plausible that you could have state control of other drugs. Already, that is in effect what the Netherlands is moving towards in relation to cannabis. We're likely to see one or two American states moving towards that in relation to magic mushrooms in the next few years. So I mean, this is the way forward. I think it's just a question of doing the background intellectual research to show people it's not, it actually is the most sensible way forward, and then obviously evaluating any changes in policy if they're brought in.
Professor Nutt, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Gina Martin successfully led the campaign to make upskirting a criminal offence, and she's now written a book about how others can channel their passion against injustice into effective action. And she's with me now. Welcome to you.
Hiya.
Where do you stand on drugs?
Oh, God, it's a difficult one. Let's not get into that, because I'll be here all night.
Well, tell me, I mean,
I think they need to be regulated properly. I think there's so much going on because they're not regulated properly, and there's also a lot of ignorance around the structure of criminals, and the kind of injustice in drugs is kind of a big issue. So I feel like it needs to be regulated better, is my personal opinion.
And if you wanted to achieve that, I mean, you're not a drugs campaigner,
yeah,
clear,
not.
But you're offering general advice. If you wanted to achieve that, how would you advise people to pursue it? Because that's what it's about.
It's a difficult one. I get asked this a lot on constant different campaigns, is how to do that specific campaign. And also the biggest advice I always give in the book is you have to research it and know it very well, and I don't immediately with that question. But I think you would get the right people on board who are specialists and understand that world, both in the regular street and also in science, like we've just talked to this wonderful man here. And you would have to be clever about it and strategise and come up with a realistic plan, because I think so often we have great grand ideas of how to change things, but we're not looking at what's actually happening with regular people. You need to be more realistic about these things, I think, often.